tell founders all the time, you're taking on another full-time job to raise money, like a lot of money, the
Right.
even several hundred thousand or to the millions, or selling a company, same thing. It's really sort of like dating, but it's dating like if there was like an unfiltered version where you've got your parents setting you up with some other parents and they're trying to figure out what's going on, but it's like, give me a sheet about, give me a disclosure about what your child does for a living and who they sell their products to and how much money do they make and have they paid their taxes, because I'm going to need a representation and warranty that all taxes have been paid in every jurisdiction that you operate. So I mean the dating's a funny example, but it's like really
It was
le-
so funny the example you gave there, because you said dating, and then the moment you were like who have they been selling their products, I was like, hold on a minute, where are you going with this, Ryan? I
who
was like,
it might be who have you been seeing and who have you gone on dates with in the past, raised money from, um, all those things.
raise money from, come on, Ryan, that's not legal here, is it?
I'm not trying to tie it that way, but
We're back, baby. What's up, guys? Welcome to the Wolf of Young Street podcast. My name is Victor. I'm your host. It's been a while we had a guest in the house, but today I've got one. Ryan Bencic is my guest today, and he is a lawyer. And I know when I first mentioned to my wife that I had a lawyer on the show, she was sweating a little bit. But no, Ryan Bencic is actually a startup lawyer. And that's probably not very accurate because he works with new companies throughout their life cycle. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
thanks, Victor, for having me. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
funny.
my
It's
wife is just clapping for you here. She's just clapping for you as well here. So welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I want to hear about your story. I want to hear about how this all started for you and why startups. You could work with companies that are a bit more sure-footed, more comfortable. Why are you working with startups, man?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny. I started it as a lawyer in Edmonton. Well, did my business undergrad, was interested in starting businesses without realizing it, having seen my dad be a bit of an entrepreneur over the years himself. Like he had tried to start some educational software companies with friends. Years later, I found out he took a company public, and I didn't know about this. And
Wow.
he was building homes as a sort of like a residential contractor, or building homes in St. Albert, where we grew up for years. And so part of it's the upbringing and seeing that from my dad. The other part of it was I was in Edmonton one day, funny enough, driving. So I was in Edmonton working at a law firm. I was doing mostly dirt law, which is not bad law. It's just commercial real estate, land development, leasing. It's all things involving dirt and buildings. And
Mhm.
I was driving through a random part of Edmonton one day, and I realized I saw a nail salon that I was just doing a lease review on. So you're reviewing leases for a big development in a new part of town where they're building a mall and a sort of a mall, a grocery store, a bank, usually a Winners or a TJ Maxx store. And so I saw a nail salon, a bank, and one of the TJ Maxx companies, and I realized that, hey, that's funny. That was just like what I was reviewing over here, but in a completely different part of town. And then I
Wow.
went back to the office. I checked the title, and funny enough, it was actually one of the properties we were working on. And something in me clicked, and I just sort of fast forwarded 30 years of my career. And there was something where I just sort of asked myself, is that the legacy I'd be really excited about? And something about that didn't really speak to me. And I realized as much fun as I was having, as great of the people as I was working with, and as much as I was learning at the time about land and real estate and development, I sort of recognized and something boiled to the surface or bubbled to the surface, and I realized that I was missing something more. And so startups was around the same time I was chatting with a friend, and he was looking to acquire baby boomer businesses as they were looking to retire, and they didn't have a succession plan. And so he talked me through this plan, his idea. I forget how we came across each other at the time because it's sort of a mutual friend, but this chance encounter coupled with that moment where I realized I want to do something else really stuck with me, and it sort of sparked this interest of us talking about, well, why don't we work together? Why don't we try this? And so it was from that sort of genesis that I realized that this was an outlet I really wanted to try. And then eventually I left the law firm to work with a friend, and we started our first business, where we acquired one about 100 days later.
Wow. So, what was your experience? Obviously you ran that business for a little while. So I want to know what that experience was like running a business as a founder yourself.
Yeah, that one was different because we acquired a brick and mortar business. It was more of an industrial company. The high level was we sort of learned, I mean, candidly, a lot didn't go right. A lot didn't transition with the clients. And so I'd say the better experience was in a lot of ways we learned about how not to acquire business in our 20s.
Wow.
We learned what could go wrong. We learned with customer concentration risk. I mean, some of the things that went right were we streamlined a lot of the operations. We streamlined a lot of the onboarding and payroll. Payroll used to be this big stressful thing that took 2 or 3 days, and we got it down to a half an hour job, 20-minute job in terms of calculating hours and paying people because you had to pay people in this space, you had to pay people almost daily.
Wow.
So you had all these like little business bottlenecks, and so we streamlined a lot of those. I think we added about maybe not quite a million, but maybe high hundreds of thousands in terms of new top line revenue. So there were some learnings, there were some good parts that we did, but ultimately we just learned a lot about how not to transition to business and what could go wrong, and it's probably for another day, but lots of learnings.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, what would you say? Obviously, as a lawyer, I'm sure the approach you took to the business involved a lot of law-related stuff. So, what were the sort of the legal challenges and the legal hurdles you had to face as the founder of a startup at that particular moment?
Yeah, a big one is just figuring out where to get started. It's
Wow.
it's
Okay.
super it's totally intimidating. I mean, what do we call our company? Are we allowed to call our company that? Has anyone else called their company that? Right? You
Wow.
don't want to steal someone's name or brand, and so when you're actually put on the spot, it's intimidating even just to figure out a name. Like figure out a name, figure out your brand, and just even really get the ball rolling from just that first step. From there,
Wow.
it's like trying to figure out what the equity split should be. It's all totally in a vacuum because you're working with people for the first time. So we started with three co-founders, and eventually we went down to two. But when we started with three, should it have been one third, one third, one third? Should it have been 50, 25, 25? There's a lot of possibilities in having those early chats with founders. It's not easy, but they're really important.
Right. So I think the way I want to structure this is I want us to go through the process here from getting started to we eventually we'll talk about the go-to-market strategy, we'll talk about
Yeah.
scaling, and then we'll talk about exit and acquisition. So obviously, founders come to you. In this case of a podcast, I'm a one-man army with my wife. Sometimes, occasionally, giving me support on there. Mostly moral, but
You've got Thor behind you to help out.
there you go. So I've got Thor helping me every time. But as if when a person comes to you, they say, and I don't know what part where you get involved the first time with most businesses. Maybe you can clarify that for me. Do you get involved even before they create their minimum viable product, or like if you're getting involved before then? Okay, how do you with sort of input from the founder and kind of question them to make sure that help them ascertain that they've got an idea that will float in the market, that kind of thing, in terms of like feasibility studies and all of that. I want to know how you get involved or if you get involved in a particular stage.
Yeah, it's funny. As lawyers, you sort of get involved when you need to and when you find that right fit with the client. There's times we get involved just when someone's about to sell. They've worked with another law firm for a while. They might have even worked with a law firm up to this point in time, but for whatever reason, they just need a different set of hands or a little bit more help or someone with my experience or my team's experience to get there for the sale. But often we usually get involved somewhere between, hey Ryan, I'm at a cocktail party, I've got a crazy idea. What do you think of it? Right?
Right.
So it starts sometimes there. Sometimes it's, hey, I've been thinking about this for a while and I've been talking with friends and I've written it down on a napkin. Can we talk about the napkin?
Mm,
Other times it's, we've already started a company, we've already done this, we're looking to raise money. We've actually landed a term sheet from an investor and we're looking to raise our first, it's usually between 200-ish thousand to sometimes it's the first couple million. And they haven't really
Wow.
had a lawyer helping them out for the first 2 million, like for the first $2 million financing. Everything to date has really been sort of on the founder's shoulders, and it's really admirable how they've gotten it that far. But as soon as you start getting outside investors involved, outside eyes, things really have to start legally falling into place and be cleaned up. And what I mean by that is like we really need to know how much equity everyone owns.
Mm,
Like how much of the podcast does Victor and his wife own? What are the
right.
vesting terms? Right? Have you given equity to a previous friend or an employee or a contractor or an advisor?
Right.
Was any of the equity subject to vesting, so you have to earn it over time? Or have you actually carved up and given out your company and given huge pieces to people who are no longer involved? Or in the next year and a half, they might not be involved, and that's okay. But part of the equity, part of the deal when you usually raise outside money is they're usually giving outside money contingent on the existing team for the most part staying for several years. Usually it's about 4 years or 5 years in terms of vesting. And so when we really get involved tends to be mostly around that time when someone's raising their first sizable chunk of money, the first time they're dealing with outside investors, or when they're scaling or going to market and they've got a product, they've got traction, they've got all the tenets of product market fit there. They're so
Yeah.
busy they can't deal with it. They've got enough money that they can actually pay lawyers because we know lawyers aren't cheap. And
Okay.
they've done this amazing job, and usually it's sort of a pulled together paper that's, so, I mean, sometimes there's paper, sometimes there's no paper agreement, and they're just selling a product based totally on the service itself. And
Wow.
so
Okay.
usually it's coming into those 2 points of going to market, scaling, or really growing rapidly, and they recognize they need help, or the first time they're raising outside venture capital.
Yeah. Wow. I just had you just riff off there. That was great. That was so good. Um so
Thanks.
have you ever had to tell like a new founder that your idea is not going to work, and how did that kind of go down in terms of like what was the basis of you having to tell that founder that?
It's funny you asked that. I think I get ideas that are along a spectrum. Some
Right.
ideas are some ideas come through my door and I'm thinking, oh, I know I either have actual clients doing that and then there's a different conflicts issue about whether we can act, or
Hmm.
I've seen other people in the market or I've heard about other people in the market or I'm sort of loosely familiar with this idea. Is it's there's some familiarity to the I've never thought about that, but that's really interesting. And then when I
Yeah.
look way over there, I'm like, what the hell was that idea? I've never heard about that. I And sometimes I'm like, well, let's back up for a second. What am I missing to even understand this idea? So it's usually then we will dive deeper into, well, okay, that's a really interesting solution, but let's back up. I mean, what's the problem? Like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Who are you working with? Is this a very niche problem for a very niche space?
Right.
Okay. Or, and sometimes it's okay, well, I've got to understand a little bit more about, okay, so who are the players? How do we get here? What's the problem? How do people typically solve this right now? It's often usually a duct tape solution that people just grin and bear it because there's no cost-effective solution at scale where people can
Right.
buy it. So that's a hint we're checking some boxes. But I mean some of the ideas are a little bit out there and admittedly I'm not always sold on them, but that's also not my job. My job is to understand what you're doing, what the problem is, what you need help with, or what we together think you need help with and you want us to tackle now, and where it's going. And it really all comes back to that question of what are you doing right now, where are you going, and how can we help along the way? I just also want to say it's really also not my place or my right or my, I don't want to say responsibility, but it's not really for the lawyers to shut down the ideas that are out there because if something's truly innovative, I do have to remind myself that if you've got a contrarian, innovative idea, it should sound crazy, and that's okay, right? Like, I was having this chat with my partner the other day, and we were
Yeah.
talking, and it's sort of we stumbled upon the idea of well, because she's working on a business and a model in her mind, and it's like it's okay if people say no. In fact, we should really hope a lot of people tell you no, and that's not a great idea, because
Mm.
if everyone tells you it's a great idea, you might have to ask yourself, do I have too obvious of a solution? Why hasn't anyone built it? Is it maybe a problem where it's like a deep tech or a really heavy and costly hardware investment problem? And it's not going to work because it's so expensive that no one's even bothered to solve it,
I see.
right? Or so on the one hand, if a lot of people don't like the idea and if a lot of people like the idea and it's really common sense and obvious, it has
Right.
its own it has its own risks and problems. On the
Yeah,
other
yeah.
hand, if someone says, "Hey, this idea is nuts," or I had no idea, I mean, instead of nuts or crazy, I think the better analogy is more like, or the better description is more like, "Hey, that idea is really out there, and I had no idea that was a problem. I didn't
Right.
appreciate that in the food service industry, costs are so tight that we can really make a huge difference, or your client can make a huge difference by offering this software at scale for making purchasing inventory, not having inventory go bad, and being able to purchase new supplies a little bit easier, like one business."
Right.
Or I didn't realize that forest fires were such a problem that this solution is actually needed just to track fires because we've sort of accepted that we can't put out all the fires in any province now. It's a better,
Mm.
we'll never be able to put out all the fires. The best we can do is try to prevent fires, understand where the fuel sources are, the high risk areas are, and when small fires come up, we just get to them earlier. So small fires stop at small fires.
Right.
And so in a lot of ways, a lot of my learning, and I'd say a lot of professional advisors' jobs are not to it's never to shut down the ideas that are out there. I think it's more our job to understand, oh, what's going on in that space, and that's learning for me to understand what's in that space, why is it a problem, use the common frameworks I've sort of talked about a couple times in terms of understanding how deep is the issue, how painful is the pain point, how large is the demand in terms of that solution. And then once I get a better idea of how I understand the problem, then we go back to the framework of, well, what are you doing today and how can we help? And where are you going? And so
Right.
back to the crazy ideas, let's say we've shut down ideas, or we've sort of asked, let's say, rather than shutting down ideas, we usually ask tough questions that can't be answered, or
Hmm.
we ask tough questions that can't be answered for costs that are within the client's budget.
Right.
People might have grand ambitions that are just not going to be cost effective to start, or there's such a crazy amount of capital investment on the legal side, the hardware side, the software side, the traction side. And in many ways, it's just a really complicated idea that hasn't been simplified enough yet. And so things
Yeah.
don't get off the ground because they're complicated. But
Right.
I just think it's important to reiterate, my job is never to call an idea crazy. In fact, some of the wildest ideas I've heard are some of my favorite clients now because
Wow.
I've taken the time to understand. I've taken a lot of time to try to understand their business, and offline I'll read a little bit more in my own time just to try to get things. But um, we as outside advisors, it's not our job to fully evaluate ideas themselves. I think our job is really to bring tangibility to, well, that's an interesting idea. Here's how we might try to pull it off, or here's a common framework that de-risks some of it by using a common frameworks, breaking ideas down, answering some questions about how to own and operate and test and iterate and go to market it, and then go back at scale, and where you might need money along the way and people along the way. And but it's just, how do we break things down and apply the common frameworks to actually de-risk some of the uncertainty?
Interesting. Actually, let's tie that up. So before we move on to the go-to-market strategies, by the way, so if you, what are the so in terms of like I'm talking in terms of incorporation of the business and shareholder agreements and stuff like that that come up at the start of the life of a company.
Yeah.
What are the major, or what are the, I don't know, first three or four or whatever number of things that a lawyer would make sure that a company has in place, a new company has in place?
Yeah, it's such an important question, such an important thing that every founder should really ask themselves. And so I want to differentiate first between a business where it's a podcast where it's maybe closely held just by yourself or with you and your wife. Maybe you're not even incorporated yet, and that's okay too, right? But as soon as we start getting people involved as soon as we start getting a company where there's more than one person, where we're going to be working on an idea for many years, where our plan is to raise outside capital, these sorts of businesses are different than the I want to start a roofing business with my brother. I want to
Hmm.
start a I want to start a delivery business with my sister. I want to start a business with my best friend, and the two of us want to hold it together. We just want to install putting greens, is another interesting one I've heard lately. We just want to
Right.
install really neat putting greens in people's backyards, and it's only going to be owned by two of us forever, Victor. You and me, we're going to go into business, and it's going to be RV putting, and we're okay with this sort of thing. And, right, and that's a totally different business. And so in many cases, shareholder agreements are important, but I'm differentiating not between the brick and mortar small businesses where you won't raise outside capital, but it's the venture-backed businesses where you raise outside capital from third-party investors, be it angels or VCs and so on. That's kind of more my space where these agreements are a little bit more important. And so within this space, the biggest things off the beginning are you want to make sure you've incorporated. So we have a company, we have a vehicle. You want to make sure you've issued shares properly to founders. So let's figure out our ownership split. So there's the incorporation process itself. There's the share issuance. There's the director onboarding. Those things are sort of needed for every company. But now to your key agreements that you need. Uh, Without fail, let's say everyone needs to assign their intellectual property to the company. So they need to assign all the intellectual property from up to this point in time and going forward. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two agreements, but intellectual property assignments. We should have everyone under a contractor or an employment agreement. Sometimes that will deal with intellectual property. It should deal with things like confidentiality. More importantly, it just sort of crystallizes the relationship that we're not just two buddies in our backyard or two buddies in our living room building a business. I mean, we
Not
might
when
still
money
be,
is involved. Not when money is
but
involved.
even before then, it sort of brings this legitimacy. And then if we want to grow our business and scale and get it get it up there, we really have to get these foundational agreements in place and just confirm, hey, Victor, you're an employee, you're running the show. Ryan is a part-time contractor, and while we're working the business together and we both have equity, Victor's the CEO and Ryan is the maybe a fractional COO or a fractional CTO. And I'm just a contractor and that's okay. But if for whatever reason I want to quit or it doesn't work out with me, you as the CEO who's running this business and it's your vision, your idea, we've got to have that relationship. So
Mm,
it's intellectual property agreements, it's your employment and contractor agreements, it's definitely your shareholders agreement.
right.
The big one, the shareholders agreement, for those that haven't heard about this or you've heard about it, and it's big and scary. Sometimes they're called unanimous shareholders agreements. It's a different regime in Canada. Sometimes they're just
Right.
shareholders agreements. BC is a little bit different than the rest of Canada, but broadly speaking, it governs the relationship between the shareholders for how directors get appointed, for important things like how new shares are issued, how new funds might be raised, how debt might be taken on. Um, when new shares are being issued, do you have to offer them to everyone else to maintain their relative preemptive, like their relative pro rata ownership or not?
Right.
When people want to transfer shares, we have to have restrictions in Canada. So
Right.
Victor, Victor and his wife, I mean, Victor might be able to transfer some shares to his wife, or Victor and his wife, if they both have shares, could transfer shares to a family trust because the shareholders agreement says you two can do that. But otherwise,
Mm,
it says you two can't even transfer your shares to each other unless there's an exception. And we
wow.
kind of want to shut things down. Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive, but even Victor transferring to Victor is actually shut down in most shareholders agreements unless we have
Wow.
exceptions. Yeah, I mean, we really want to issue equity to you and we really want it to stay with you unless we have these common exceptions like usually it's a trust owned by family, like for your family members or spouse or children or things like that, to an RESP or RRSP, to a TFSA, to a holding company for estate planning purposes. We sort of give these exceptions, but we don't want Victor to be transferring his shares to a competitor,
Mm,
or we don't want Victor to be transferring his shares to Joe Blow on the street because part of it's based on securities laws in Canada. We have to have these restrictions. So part of it's because we have to. But we sort of hamper these things down too. So we know the equity stays with these people who started the company. We know the equity stays with people like employees who've earned it over time. And that's really important to investors when they look at these sorts of shareholders agreements because they want to see that the equity won't be sold to some stranger on the street who now has a say in how directors are appointed.
Right, 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 right.
There's a lot more going on, but the key parts of a shareholders agreement too are really just who should be the directors, how shares should be issued, and you want to have these starting points sometimes even before you talk with investors, because one, if you're not going to talk to investors for a year or two, if me and Victor start a podcast together and there's a falling out, we really should try to deal with that in advance so the podcast goes on, and maybe
Right,
Ryan's not a part of it, and that's okay. Maybe I still get a piece of my equity in the podcast and I've got to be a champion, but we don't want to have holdout risk where if things don't work out, there's just a fight and then both sides spend too much money fighting instead of it being, well, Ryan's no longer involved. Unfortunate, but he's still got some equity. The equity that Ryan has in the podcast is protected, and that's important for me. And Victor can still keep growing the podcast, and everyone's better off because you're growing the podcast, the value of the company, and it benefits Ryan because my equity is protected and it's growing under Victor's leadership.
right, right,
So,
right.
but yeah, to summarize, it's intellectual property agreements, some sort of employment or contractor agreement, shareholder agreements as good starting points. So you can negotiate with investors based on your starting point, not
Hmm.
necessarily theirs. And sort of one of the final ones I would say would be the reverse vesting agreements.
Okay. What
When
is
pe
that?
Yeah, when people are given equity in a company, well, when people buy equity in a company, so
Right,
if Victor, Ryan, and Victor's wife off camera are the three co-owners of this podcast, maybe it's Victor and his wife each have 40% of the podcast and Ryan has 20%. Well, that's great that we get this equity. We're probably not going to pay ourselves from day one. We're probably going to put a bunch of sweat equity into this business and grow it. Um,
right,
but it might take us a year or two before we get any traction at all. And then someone might even consider giving us a sponsorship.
right.
And so what happens if you've given Ryan, because I'm the outsider here, we've got the family units over here, which is okay. But I'm
Yeah,
clearly the outsider here. And
right.
so it's like, what happens if I get hit by a bus? Or what
Oh,
happens if I have a bad skiing accident and I'm no longer able to help the business? Or
sorry, Ryan.
I know, or
I'm really sorry about that. Sorry that happened to you, man.
yeah, or I walk across the street on my cell phone and I get hit by a bus, and you get these bad examples, or life circumstances change and I want to move somewhere with my partner, or I want to go
Right,
back to school, or um, we're doing this thing but it's not paying me, and I get a job somewhere where it's just not practical. I move 13 hours of time zones ahead, and it's just not going to
right,
work for me working. You've already given me 20% of the company. I've paid for it.
right,
So what happens when you're trying to raise money and you tell investors, yeah, that Ryan guy, no longer involved. He's got 20% of my company, but I want you to give me this valuation for my company.
mm,
They're going to say, what the hell? I'm not going to give you any money.
right, right,
So how we do that is we should say we have this deal among founders, and there's sort of a common best practice that founders' equity is usually earned over 3 to 5 years. Usually it's about 4 years is sort of the sweet spot where for the first year, no one earns any equity. There's a cliff. And within that cliff, if anyone leaves, if anyone's terminated, if anyone just doesn't want to be a part of it anymore, it's okay because the equity is essentially bought and canceled by the company, and that's
right,
okay. Whereas the three of us, if we're working on this business, we want to incentivize people to be with us with the podcast for years, but maybe people want to earn their equity for a year and a half, or 2 years, or 3 years, or maybe I'm the CTO right now, but in 3 years from now, we need to hire a better CEO to hit that next level of scale. That's okay. I've earned my equity up to the 3 year point. Maybe it's a good time for me to transition where I don't want to be a part of it anymore. And a new CTO
mm,
comes in, and I'll have earned 3 out of 4 years worth of my equity. And
right,
so reverse vesting agreements are essentially a deal where we'll issue shares to Victor, to Victor's wife, and Ryan from day one. We own our shares. We can totally vote our shares to appoint directors, to make decisions. Um, you probably shouldn't be issuing dividends, but if you were to issue dividends, like we get those things as we get those things as shareholders from day one. But again, if anyone leaves for whatever reason or is no longer able to be part of the company, there's sort of a mechanism where the company can buy it back. And it really serves like a mortgage.
right.
So if you're in your house, Victor, and let's pretend you own it, or do you own your house?
No, I do not. Yeah.
let's pretend you own your house, and for anyone who owns the home out there, you own a home, but while you have a mortgage, what happens if you stop paying,
Oh, the bank takes it back now.
right? And so, but who really owns the home while there's a mortgage?
The
Is
bank.
it? And so in some ways, conventionally, Victor owns the home, but
Right.
until the mortgage is gone, until the reverse vest has happened, so the company's right to buy back your shares has diminished over time till it's zero. In some ways, it's how we keep founders incentivized to keep paying their mortgage or keep
Right.
working away and chipping away at their mortgage with work and sweat equity is the
Right.
vesting agreements. So you've got the vesting agreement until the company's right diminishes to zero, and then you'll own your equity. And
Right.
that's how we incentivize you to be involved for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Usually it's the 1 year cliff. So the first year is nothing. You earn your equity equally over 4 years after that. Um, it might be quarterly, it might be monthly, and we do that so I'm incentivized to keep working on your podcast over time. And investors want to see this. I mean, these are sort of the bread and butter where founders don't have these IP agreements, these contractor or employment agreements, a shareholders agreement, and definitely some sort of vesting agreements. It's like
Right.
you got to chat with your lawyers right away because you sort of need these things before you can have any real conversation with outside investors. And it's
Right.
okay if they don't have them today because a lot of founders don't have these things. In fact, sometimes we'll spend months trying to figure out, well, how many shares does Victor, his wife, and Ryan own when there's all these conflicting records about, does Victor have share certificates 11, 13, and 15 that add up to this? Or does Victor have, but like Victor's wife has 12 and 13 and 16 over here, and Ryan has 16 and 7 and 5 over there. And
Right.
so it's okay if these things aren't in place today, but they're really a sort of thing you need to get in place soon if you want to grow a company, whether it's with outside money or just generally as a best practice. These are the
Mm.
sorts of things so you incentivize people to stay for the long run. And a lot of what we do as lawyers is not to try to over prescribe what people have to do. If we've done
Yeah.
things well with agreements, like like with any good product market fit, the market should pull the product.
Right.
Um, with these vesting agreements, the incentives should pull the founder to want to stay involved.
Right. Right. Wow. Okay. Now let's talk about go-to-market strategies. So at this point, I imagine that the founder and his team has built up like some intellectual property. They've built some minimum viable product, and that they're now ready to take this product to market. We can use any example you want there. I think the examples help crystallize ideas for people. So I'm open to playing roles here. So just pick a business, and we could do that easy.
Well, we can still do a podcast. Let's take the podcast example.
Okay, okay, okay. So what? How do you? Obviously, the go to market is slightly different here. It's like, okay, right before, I assume at this point in time, this is right before I put out the first episode of the podcast. You guys don't go check out the first episode of the podcast. There were a few things I was still learning at the time. Okay. Anyways, so so carry on.
Yeah. So with the going to market, I mean, so with the going to market or GDM strategy, we're thinking. I mean, some of the base assumptions are. I mean, you have product market fit when you have no when you have product market fit, but
Right.
counter as paradoxical as that might be, um, we're probably if we're thinking about going to market, we're probably in a space where you've actually built something, you've tested with users, you probably have a recurring base of products, and in this case, products are going to be guests like us coming on the podcast. So you've got
Right.
interesting guests, you've got no shortage of guests, you've got no shortage of users. You've been doing this for long enough that you've got decent engagement across the different metrics, whether it's on like your Spotify apps, your LinkedIn, your YouTube, whatever the platform is, you've got some real traction. And so with going to market, we're going to be talking about common, like the first step is going to be just a quick legal audit. Well, what do you have in place right now? Do you have agreements in place with your guests? Do you have agreements in place with your suppliers or your sponsors? Do you have permission to have the things in your background on your camera? Like I see a couple books, but if you were to have a Coca-Cola logo, Do you have
Right.
Coke's permission to have Coca-Cola, plastered behind your head?
I
Um,
know I don't have Marvel's permission to have Thor up there, so that's a legal challenge waiting to happen.
no,
But
I mean,
anyways,
I'm sure in many cases it doesn't matter, but some of the real questions are when I've got customers coming to me or clients coming to me that are saying, hey, we want to go to market, we really want to grow, and usually it's we've got this base, we've been doing things well, we're getting really busy, and we've got some friction that we want to get rid of, or we need your help to try to reduce friction or make it easier to just start growing like crazy. And so, what agreements do you have in place right now with all the key players, um, your customers, your clients, your suppliers, your sponsors, the your your employees, your contractors, your founder team? What are some of those things, because they actually all sort of interplay into the go-to-market? So, do we have a good base? Where are you trying to get to? How can we usually pull together some sort of paper? Because with the lawyers, we're trying to get involved with legal problems. How do we pull together the paper to address the key issues up front in a relatively fair approach so people will read your agreements and say, that's pretty good, that's fine. If we've done our job right as a lawyer and our clients have instructed us, we should hopefully have made it really easy for people to say, oh, that contract's probably okay. Maybe they've got a couple comments or revisions here and there, but it should be that's a pretty good contract. That seems pretty reasonable. Got a couple questions. Our lawyers review it, maybe a few questions at some sort of big scale, and we're ready to
mhm,
sign on the B2B side. Or at the consumer side, like a B2C, it's like the Wolf of Young Street podcast is great. I want to like and subscribe, and I'm willing to pay, a few bucks a month to subscribe for this other tier podcast. Or I'm happy to sit through the ads, and that's just part of the podcast. And Victor's ads are actually really meaningful and relevant for what I'm listening to. So,
right,
in a lot of ways, going to market is more us trying to understand where you're trying to get to. We try to anticipate the friction points or the bottlenecks. We'll ask you, we'll try to chat through them, and usually we make a plan of how do we eliminate those and really streamline things so the legal shouldn't be the bottleneck. That's
right.
that's ultimately the goal.
So the way you've described it sounds like you're depending on or a lot of sort of everything you described to me with the startup phase to the go to market. Sounds like you're depending on the founder a lot, understanding where they sit in the market, understanding their market, and basically knowing their situation. But are there
Yeah.
tools that you guys employ outside what maybe because you know I'm thinking my original career. I don't know if I've probably discussed this with you. My original career, I'm a scientist. I'm a chemist, right?
Hmm.
So say as a chemist, I've invented this. I don't know. I work in lithium ion batteries. So say I've invented this new battery that's supposed to be the best for like electric vehicles, for example, right? Now, not a lot of founders don't necessarily understand like conceptually some of like the business side of things. Like, oh, they don't. Some of them might not know. Okay, this is possibly a problem. I might have developed this
Hmm.
perfectly good battery that may be too expensive for the EV market. Maybe I need to shift towards like I don't know, stationary storage or something like that as
Yeah.
against like EVs and that kind of thing. So what I'm saying is if you're sitting here depending on me who is a chemist to provide you with information that will eventually inform the strategy that we employ, then you're clearly going to be, or you might be misguided by me. So I wonder what additional tools you guys apply to kind of probe and maybe it's sort of like a soft check of sorts to make sure that what your founder is telling you actually tallies with what the market is expecting.
Yeah. I mean, lots sort of baked in there. A big part of it, actually, Victor, is part of us as lawyers trying to, lawyers, professional service providers. I mean, anyone who's really helping founders as outsiders, because we fundamentally are outsiders. We know that, we know, and I hope that any service provider knows that the founders and the people that are on the ground know their business better than anyone. No
Wow.
one knows
Okay.
the no one knows the Wolf of Young Street better than Victor, right?
Right.
I mean, you should know your podcast, you should know your audience, you should have rough goals about things you're working towards. You're probably still experimenting in terms of users you're chatting with or content, or you're experimenting, but you've got a vision in that you're not going a full 360 about I have no idea which direction I'm going. I'm roughly going northeast, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going west. I'm not going south. I'm roughly going northeast. I'm not sure if I should be more north or more east or more north until this
Right.
point and around, but you've got a rough
Right.
vision. So, it's us as lawyers, when you get specialists, you might get a little bit more guidance and help on in terms of some of these pieces, and especially if someone's done these things. But I'm thinking more like you've got really specialized patent lawyers who really understand the chemistry about the molecule you're trying to patent or about the battery you're trying to patent. They're going to see much more about that very, very specific niche or that
Right.
domain. But generally speaking, when I get involved with founders, a lot of my questions are actually a lot of the questions we ask should hopefully also help the founders think through that idea, because if they can answer them for us, they can probably answer them for themselves. And
Hmm.
some of them are obvious to get me up to speed, but sometimes I try to take a lot of pride in asking questions to think, well, stepping back, I mean, what are the big things we should be understanding about the market? Who is your ideal customer?
Right.
Um, or who is your mix of ideal customers that you're trying to experiment with? Where do you think you want to go? Why do you want to go that direction instead of this direction? I mean, we can talk about ideas about if founders are asking us for advice where they want to go. A lot of it still comes back to who are you working with? Where do you want to go? We should be trying to figure out what are your bottlenecks. And a lot of my advice hopefully comes from asking the right questions a little bit earlier about, well, what if that goes wrong? Well,
Mm.
okay, so we wave a magic wand. Another common thing I might say is, we'll wave a magic wand, we'll solve that problem. Where will we be and what's the next problem there?
Right.
Should we be addressing that next problem now or just deal with it when we get there?
Right.
Some things like intellectual property, we've got to get the ownership today, or we've got to at least sort out who owns the intellectual property with things like data. Like um, the world seems to be going down a path where at least with the large language models and the AI tech out there, from everything I've seen and from reviewing a lot of terms of use and far too many terms of use, and I'll actually read those things. As much as my partner teases me for actually reading terms of use
Yeah,
when
no
we're
one
signing,
reads the terms of use.
I'll sometimes read the terms of use. Sometimes they're good and they inspire.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
it's funny. I used to read Bumble's terms of use because it was actually pretty funny because it used to be written back when I was on the dating apps. I'd read Bumble's terms of use because it was actually pretty good. It was a little bit more lay. It was more informal, and sometimes I think Bumble was the one that had a line that said, "Our lawyers told us we had to say this."
That's funny. I've never read most of these terms of use, but that's funny if they had that in there though.
I
That's
think,
hilarious.
but it's just but again, so a lot of what we do, Victor, is and sorry, just to finish that thought, users tend to own the data, and then the data is licensed or assigned, or companies are granted rights. But um, in terms of going to market, in terms of like what sort of expertise do we offer, we actually try to offer more standard frameworks. And I think standard frameworks help founders de-risk the situation, because if
Hmm.
they fit within a framework that's relatively understood from my experience working with lots of founders and lots of scalable venture companies, whether it's software, hardware, tech, whatever, or services. Services can also scale. Um, if we've done our job right and we sort of know a common framework, and then we know the slightly customized framework for your service company, your data AI company, your hardware company, whatever, if we can have that common framework and we'll ask you the questions to see how you fit within it. When you go through our black box approach of our framework, on the other side, hopefully me and the founders have a better understanding of where their business might be, where they might want to go. We maybe ask some tough questions where they don't really have answers yet, and that's for their team to figure out and try to build in, see whether they want to build or not build there. And at the end of all that, hopefully they've got a better plan about how to go to market to see how they actually fit within common frameworks as a starting point, and then assessing if they
Right.
need to be the exception or if they need to be
Mm.
common to de-risk, but they need to be exceptional here and they're okay, and they think it makes more sense than to be the mean or the common, and that's okay because they know their business and you know your business so well that you know that you should take this risk and take this experiment.
Interesting. I asked that question because I wanted to get a sense of what kind of team like goes to deal with founders when they come in to meet a lawyer team like yours,
Yeah,
right? So obviously you mentioned that it might be a thing where okay they talk to a patent lawyer, right? Where say in the case of a chemistry company or a company that's invented some sort of battery, for example, we need to make sure that they haven't, while they've come this far, they've made this product that they think doesn't infringe on something, but maybe they actually have infringed on some other company's intellectual property, or maybe they need to state their patent in such a way that it doesn't it covers their backs on certain potential infringements that could come, because there's a way you can structure your patent that just allows people to just walk all over you, right? They just take your intellectual property, and the market is cold like that. They will take everything from you, right? so
yeah,
so it's like, is it usually, do you guys present these founders with a team, or
yeah.
and what does that, what is that, who are the people that you would have in your core team, or do you decide on a case by case basis who comes to talk to with founders?
Yeah, I mean, again, in terms of a legal team, it really depends on the situation for how you're reaching out to me or why you're reaching out to me. To your sort of joker at the start of the podcast, you're chatting about whether I'm a tech lawyer or something else or a startup lawyer. It's funny because
Right,
I struggle with this description myself about what I do, which some of us do in these nebulous spaces about what do we really do on a daily basis. And the answer
right.
is it always depends. It depends who emailed me that day. Some days I'm some days I'm more of a contracts lawyer. Some days
Right.
I'm more of a corporate lawyer. Some days I'm
Yeah.
more of a venture capital securities lawyer helping Victor raise his $2 million safe, like a simple agreement for future equity. Or I'm
Hmm.
chatting with Victor about what sort of cleanup he has to do to go raise money from outside investors. Or we might be talking about how you would go cross border.
Right.
Um, in a lot of cases, it sort of depends on how you get involved, but when you talk with someone like me, my bread and butter is I'm really fundamentally a business lawyer for entrepreneurs.
Right.
And so I'll work with founders on corporate problems, and that's like company and shares and structure. It's adding people to your team. It's working with your option pool for really good employees or advisors or contractors. That's the corporate side of it. The commercial side is more like the contracts, or someone else gave our customer or our client, a customer gave our client a large contract that's 60 pages long with all these complicated provisions, and how do we help them understand what their risk might be? So
Right.
it's
Right.
it's
Right.
the commercial side of things. It's the drafting the contracts. It's the understanding the contracts. That's a lot of what we do. Um, or a lot of the times it's also structuring. Victor, you want to do this thing. How do we help? How would we talk about structuring? So it's kind of the starting point would be you talk with a guy like me who's even more of a corporate commercial generalist, albeit in a
Hmm.
space where I work with founders. And then depending on what your needs are, we would loop the team in as needed. So if you're coming to Ryan first, but you need patent help, we've got folks in Vancouver where we're based, who would refer you to that are patent lawyers. Or if you've got a trademark lawyer that you need, or a copyright lawyer, we've got lawyers who are environmental litigators that might be in-house, or sometimes you might want to go out-house, like external
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah.
You might want to work with a very regulated space lawyer. Like there's certain industries like online gambling or alcohol or tobacco or some of these things that are just super regulated, and we will work with the regulated space lawyer whose only job is to read the agreements and really
Right.
advise on the commercial side of the business for how what we help with for the most part fits within their important space that underpins their space. So and sort of just to finish the other thought, you might also we might also help loop in folks on our team that are litigators or workplace and employment lawyers. So it really comes
Right.
down to my job is to, for the most part, assess what do you need, how do you think we can help, where do you think you're going, and whether it's Ryan or more senior counsel or more junior counsel or more specialized counsel or a referral to another lawyer or even accountants who we often refer clients to or work with our clients' accountants to make transactions happen. a lot of it's project management and people management and pulling it all together to make this seamless product that we just call a transaction, which is really like
Right.
20 micro transactions that all come together in one.
Yeah. As you were describing it, there sounds like you guys are the family doctors of lawyers, because you know how people only go to family doctors so they can get referral to like whoever they need to go see. It sounds like you guys are the family doctors of lawyers there.
Yeah, I mean, one of my job titles when I'm out with people is sometimes I'm your external general counsel.
Mm.
I'm your GP family doctor, but for law. Give me a call because I operate in a space. I like to say I operate in a space that's like a busy intersection. There's a lot of roads that come in. I'm that policeman that's in the middle of the road trying to guide people when the lights go out about which way you should go and who should come and who should stop. And my space is like a busy intersection where the lights aren't quite working, and a lot of it's sparing people where I'm guiding or I'm getting help guiding someone down another path.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about scaling here. So I'm just gonna just to tie it up, I'll just ask one question about scaling before we move on to exits and acquisitions. So obviously in terms of scale, what are the sort of the if you could just summarize the legal side that founder would need to have in place when they're in the point process of scaling. Again, you could use a podcast example. That's fine too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'll come back to the podcast in a sec, but just generally, before you scale, I think it's really, really important that you've got users, you've got raving fan users, you've got users who really love your product, you got users who are referring your product, you've got some predictability about growth. You've got people like whether they're paid or not. I mean, if if you're losing money a little bit per user at scale, you're going to lose a lot of money unless there's a certain point where, right? It's as counterintuitive as it is. You're going to lose a lot more money unless there's a point where you're losing a little bit of money, but at a certain point it actually gets easier and cheaper. So at scale, we
Yeah.
might, we might have to take an uneconomic leap to and risk to grow at scale to a point where it will make sense at scale, but it doesn't make sense now. Okay, but um, the key assumptions are we've got a product, we've got users, we've got some ability to recreate or replicate the service or product and delivery, and we can do all that in a way that we can do it more times more efficiently.
Right.
And so once we've got all these conditions in place, then the scale conversation comes up. If we're before that point, scale's risky.
Mm.
It's unnecessary. Scale's always risky, but it's unnecessarily risky if you don't have those basic assumptions to get to this point. But now we've got them. So what are the key legal considerations? It's a lot of it's um, and I want people to think about their common apps that they're using. Like think about an app. Apps are the easiest example, but think about something like a podcast you've subscribed to. Think about the music streaming playlist or platform or app that you have in your pocket. Um, think about your gym or your membership or how you sign up for workout classes or how you stay
Yeah.
active. Everyone's got these things that they use. And so the key legal considerations are usually how do you onboard people? How do you onboard people in terms of process? What sort of terms do people agree to? The reality is at scale, there's probably some legal considerations that we have to put into paper. So, well, how do you onboard people? What do the terms look like? In terms of the terms themselves, I mean, what are you charging? What are the termination provisions to both start and end? Along the way, who delivers the thing, like the service? Is it you or some other third-party licensor? Is the company granting a license to use other people's software and they're packaging together things? Are they just granting
Right.
the user like Victor a license to use the workout app software to access and plan his classes?
Right.
And the workout company software is allowing a gym to allow gyms to access so they can sell to users like Victor and match the two. And so what do the terms look like for that? Yeah, it's terminate like the term, the termination, a description of the service, talking about who owns the service or usually it's a license to use or access platforms, use
Right.
applications as long as you're paying for them or as long as you maintain an account. Usually some prohibitions about things that if you do these things, you might get a warning or you might get kicked off the application or we have a right to terminate you and cancel everything you have on there. And then usually in terms of the lawyers, we want to have things that minimize our client's liability. So
Right.
if we're acting for a podcast or an app or someone who's looking to scale, one of my biggest goals is I want to enable our clients to grow at scale, like with a steep curve or a very exponential curve. And we do that by having agreements that are reasonable agreements. They're pretty fair from outsiders. They should be, you read it and it makes sense. It's pretty reasonable. There shouldn't be any sneaky provisions in there. There should be no gotchas. There should be no loopholes or fine print that, you read this thing and you're like, what the hell? I just gave up my soul and now I have to name my first three kids after this application. Are you serious? We don't want to put those
Yeah.
things in there. And we want
Yeah.
to enable the product to grow at scale with the paper, but we want to try to manage the risk flat or at a less steep curve. So
Right.
we might try to limit the liability of our clients at scale. So it's really to what you've paid the app,
Right.
right? So if you're only charging $3 a month, we think it's fair that our clients should really limit their risk exposure to something that's more commensurate with the service. So
Right.
it might be a fixed amount. It might be tied to what you've paid. The most common thing we see in when we're drafting these agreements, both with ourselves and in the market, is we might limit Victor's podcast liability to what users have paid Victor's podcast in the last 3 months or 6 months under the agreement, or $1,000, whatever's greater.
Right. Okay.
So it's
So
managed. Sorry, just to close the thought, it's
yeah,
managing
yeah, yeah.
it's managing risk at scale and flattening the risk while trying to do the things that would cultivate the ecosystem to support the vertical growth. And I think if you do that right, you manage the risk, you manage the growth. Even if things go wrong or there's lawsuits in at scale, there will always be a lawsuit, whether it's a 1 in 10,000 user or a 1 in 100. I mean, we have these conversations, and I've got a client or we have a client who they've got something like tens of thousands of users. And when we
Right.
change their terms, inevitably one or two people might ask questions.
Right.
And we're talking over tens of thousands of users. So it's actually a really good example where my one comment that I have with this clients is at scale, probability becomes inevitability.
For sure. For sure.
And so a 1 in 10,000 problem reveals itself when you have 10 or 20,000 users. And then we just have to deal with it for the one or two
I
situations that come up.
I mean, check out what Facebook and some of these social medias are suffering right now at scale, right? It's wild.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
a lot of what we do is just managing the risk at scale to allow the business to grow faster.
Right. So the final question I had on scaling though was, so I interviewed a guy a little while ago. He makes like camouflage technology for like the military and stuff like that.
Neat. He makes
And
invisibility cloaks.
oh yeah, you've seen that episode. Yeah. So and the thing was he really wanted to license the his tech as against going into mass production by himself, right? He didn't want to open a whole factory opening and making stuff for like the US military or something like that. He wanted to create that technology and hand it over to someone who, well, have them pay him, of course, to mass produce that. And obviously there's that balance there that needs to be struck where a founder needs to decide whether they want to be involved in the scale up aspect or if they want to get the
Yeah,
product to a
absolutely.
point where it's ready to be mass produced and then license it off. So how do you guys make that choice with your
Yeah,
clients, of course?
yeah. It's actually, and it sort of fits into that conversation. Like, I think we've talked about acquisitions, and I think we'll eventually get to
We're
acquisitions
going
or
to
exit.
talk about
Yeah,
acquisitions. Yeah, yeah.
and this feeds into that perfectly because at every I like to think about businesses like a staircase. You start off on one plateau, and at a certain point, you've hopefully grown to a point where there's a lot of growing pain, like a step, but you get to the next step, and the plateau might be bumpy, it might be flat, it might even be steep, but it's never as steep as the next jump to the next plateau. And
Mm,
so we keep thinking in terms of staircases. That sort of aligns with the venture capital cycle for those that raise money. And it's not
right.
just limited, this example is not limited to them, but it's when you think about whether you want to make a massive investment and a massive risk, because you've got a business that's working, it's working for selling your invisibility cloaks maybe at a smaller scale. Maybe it works for a single store. but you can't even sell to multiple stores and department stores that would want to buy 10,000 of your product because you can't make 10,000 visibility cloaks. You only have so much magic in your wand. Um, you really got to ask yourself those questions like, do you honestly want to take on that risk knowing that what's working right now is working? You've relatively owned your plateau, but do you want to take that risk and climb the next chasm or climb that next plateau, not knowing what's on the other side? And as you're climbing it, you're incurring costs, you're taking risk, you are doing things that are unfamiliar that you're not good at because you're good at doing this thing, but you've got to take on new things and get better. So as you climb that next plateau, do you want to take that risk and do it? Is it a small plateau? Are there ways you can de-risk or shorten that plateau to get better equipment or people to better manage and de-risk the situation so it's less risky to climb that plateau? But you got to ask, do I want to do that? Do I want to take on that risk? What are the risks? Are they the type of risk where I can come back from and stop? Like
Right.
Jeff Bezos wrote a really good essay about type 1 versus type 2 risks, or type 1 and type 2 decisions. And I always forget
Right.
the difference, but let's pretend type 1 decisions are the really important ones and type 2 decisions are the really unimportant ones. And
Right.
it comes down to, is this a decision where we cannot come back from it?
I see.
It's
I see. I see.
it's so expensive, it's so risky. We're pivoting the company. We're pivoting in a way that we're going to have to invest in new, and we might have to lay people off. We're totally changing things, and if we're wrong, it's really expensive or really bad or worse.
Mm.
So those type 1 decisions, you've got to think about them a lot more carefully. You've got to have those questions with your lawyers. You've got to have those questions with your accountants, your advisors, your customers. You've really got to think about those questions because if you're wrong, you might lose everything or more. And type 2 decisions are the easier ones where they're, you know what, maybe Victor's podcast wants to dabble in sports. And, what's the worst that happens? You interview 3 local athletes or 3 regional or national athletes, and you meet some interesting people, and your users just don't really care for athletes. They want to talk more about startups. Or, you interview a lawyer, a startup lawyer, a tech lawyer, and users really just don't care what the lawyers are saying, and they just want to focus on some neat product or the neat technology, and they want to focus on AI like everyone. So, the user base
Right.
drops off. You've taken a risk. You made a type 2 decision that's a low investment decision or a decision where you can totally come back from, and you just don't invite any more lawyers in the podcast if it doesn't work, right? So
Ryan's gonna ruin it for all the lawyers that come in on the podcast.
I hope not. No, I'll get some angry emails and some angry postal after. Um,
That's funny.
but really, like coming back to the question, as much as I joke about it, Victor, um, founders have to really ask themselves this. If founders have partners, like business partners and relationship partners, they should really ask them too, because they've inadvertently signed on for the ride. I mean, your wife has signed up for the podcast, whether she likes it or not, right? I mean, it's a Saturday, we're interviewing, we're chatting. Um, your wife has got to sign on to this podcast, and so if you say, hey, I really want to do this, and I want to quit my relatively safe income earning job where I've got an employment agreement, and I want to quit that and I want to take the risk to do podcasting full time. I mean, hopefully your partner is okay with that and you're comfortable having those tough questions and those tough
Right.
conversations. And
Right.
so, like the broad principles I'd say are, really ask yourself, do you want to do this? Is this a type 1 or type 2 decision where I really have to think a lot more carefully and spend more time asking my advisors and lawyers and accountants? You're even paying money to vet these ideas out about whether it's worth exploring, or should I just try it? It's a low
Mm.
stakes investments type 2. And then once you've asked those right questions, then we sort of get to the how do you do it. But before there, I think if the founders have to ask those questions and they should proactively seek out the advice. They should proactively seek out counter advice why they shouldn't do it. And then once they take all these things in, they should just make a decision. Does it align with their
Right.
values? Based on what they know, does their gut say they should try it? Or they should keep looking further, or they shouldn't do it?
Yeah, so I wanted you to tie that into why what determines the choice between choosing to license and choosing to scale. I
Hmm.
know you talked about the risk aspect of
Yeah,
things.
yeah. So
Um,
to apply all those frameworks we chatted about for something like whether you want to license or scale, I mean, some of the big questions that I would anticipate if someone came in and if Victor came in and said, I'm not sure if I want to license my visibility cloak or my hardware or my tangible good because there's a little bit more investment with tangible products or consumer products than intangible products like software or podcasts. But I want to come in and license, or I want to come in and I want to grow and do it myself. I mean, a lot of the questions are going to be, well, how much money do you have? How much runway do you have? How much investment will it be? Will you need to sign on for a lease? Is there going to be a personal liability associated with that lease? Are you going to need your wife to co-guarantee the lease, or your business partner to co-guarantee, or your business partner and your spouses to co-guarantee your idea to invest in that product? Do you have to
right,
raise outside money to do it? Well, how much is it going to
right,
cost to raise outside money? I mean, if you need, and these don't sound like these are not small sums, but 100 or $200,000, if you can't get that money from a bank, because sometimes it's too early or too risky from banks, if you need 500,000 and the most a bank will lend you is 100,000 with a steep interest rate and personal guarantees. And so the only way you can make up that shortfall is by selling off pieces of your company or loaning or
right,
to borrowing money from venture capital or outside capital to grow. Well, you have to also evaluate the cost because the cost to raise or borrow one or 200,000 from outside investors is really steep. Go borrow from the banks if you can.
right,
But if you want to raise 400,000 or 500,000 in a way that they invest in your company, you're willing to spend the legal cost to, if this is the first time you raise money, you're willing to spend the legal cost to get your company organized in a way that outside investors can do due diligence, they can understand what's going on. They also still want to buy a piece of your company after. You want to align with them and you want to have them part of this. You want them to be on this bus for this long-term journey. And if all those things check out and you want to do that, then it's okay to go forward with that risk and investment in yourself and the investment in the like the next plateau or the next piece of technology so you can make these invisibility cloaks or your product in house and you want to control it. I mean,
right,
if you want to be a part of that journey and you're not ready to say goodbye to it, if you want to take that risk and you want to be a part of learning how that next step of production works, if you find some outside investors who you're really excited to work with and you want to learn from their expertise and their experiences and you want them to be a part of your board and or advisors and have input in your company and you want to do all these things because it sounds really fun, but I know it's going to be chaotic and challenging and personally stressful and there will be really bad days and sometimes bad months. But if you think all those things are worth it for the fun and the adventure, then it can be worth it. But if those
right,
things are not what you signed up for, or it's too much risk, or too much money, or too much uncertainty, and it's sometimes just easier or more lucrative to license, it's okay to totally license that product. You license the product, you negotiate those terms, and you can actually use that money to try to do your next product in your next venture. Or you can work with the license in a way that you are a small piece of a license victor in a much larger cog in the wheel, and you actually have fun being part of a small piece of a product that's baked into a larger product. And
right,
you manage that piece of the product. And maybe over time someone wants to buy your business out, and that's a different part of the fun. And so licensing and being a part of that, or licensing so you can use those profits to generate your next idea, or just stable passive income, that's okay too,
yeah,
versus signing up for much more full-time involved all-encompassing lifestyle. I think those are
right.
some of the broader questions before you get down to the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, I think maybe the only thing that maybe you missed there, or maybe you mentioned it somewhere in there, was for the guy that invented the invisibility cloak, Guy Kramer. Shout out Guy Kramer. But for him, it was he had developed a competency. He like it was this. Basically, he has a very small team. I mean, at some point, it was only him, and the idea was this is what we're good at. We're good
Yeah,
at innovating. We're good at creating these products. But I don't want to, and this you did mention where he did not want to sign up for the scale up risk, like when, and that's where that staircase, and I'm going to tie this into exit and acquisitions.
totally. It
Um,
totally aligns for the most part.
yeah, yeah, because at certain points I found that it's not as simple a choice as, okay, do I license or do I feel like we have the bandwidth to take on scaling. At some point it's like I found it's like, you know what, I've had enough of this. I've taken as much risk as I'm willing to take. Now it's time for me to exit. So I wanted to kind of understand what are the legal preparations, so to speak, that a company needs to have in place before an exit. Maybe let's talk about an exit, and then we can talk about an acquisition, or you can take them together, however
Yeah, yeah.
is
I mean,
comfortable.
yeah. I mean, I think just leading into that discussion, the decision to license, well, the decision that you might want to raise money and take down that path where you invest in a product in like something more full suite. Let's just assume you have to raise some sort of outside capital, or the decision to at that point sell the company rather than license. It's sort of a similar decision point because we need to like sort of decision point. It's more of a similar framework because from a
Right,
legal standpoint, we need to be able to show things like ownership of company, ownership of intellectual property, the different contracts we have in place, the different personnel agreements we have in place. We have to disclose where there's litigation and what things look like and what our financials look like. Whether you're looking to raise money or you're looking to sell, I think it's really important that founders realize that while it's common to see the publicity around raising money, the publicity around raising money and the publicity around exit, they're both a similar process and they're both really, really time consuming. They're emotionally time consuming. I tell founders all the time, you're taking on another full-time job to raise money, like a lot of money, the
right.
even several hundred thousand or to the millions. You're taking on a full-time job or selling a company, same thing. You're taking on a full-time job that's probably 40 hours a week on top of your full-time job,
Yeah,
on top of being a parent, on top of being a good partner, on top of going to the gym and having sanity and being able to sleep. I mean, there's only 168 hours in a week. And I'm telling you, you're going to be taking on a job that could be 20 to 50 hours a week on top of whatever you're doing right now, whether you're raising money or you're looking to sell your business. Because if you're looking to sell
right,
your business, you can't have a customer drop off. You can't be off the ball because if bad things happen, the value of your company goes down or the deal completely dies. And so, what types of legal work goes in there? Again, it's understanding what's going on with the business. It's making sure the ownership is as it should be, which is the company should own things. You're disclosing your license agreements that are in place because you might license other technology from people. You're disclosing the software that you use, the hardware that you use. It's really sort of like dating. It's really
yeah.
like, it's like but it's dating like if there was like an unfiltered version where you've got your parents setting you up with some other parents and they're trying to figure out what's going on, but it's like, give me a sheet about, give me a disclosure about what your child does for a living and who they sell their products to and how much money do they make and have they paid their taxes? Because I'm going to need a representation and warranty that all taxes have been paid in every jurisdiction that you operate. I need a representation that your son or daughter hasn't they haven't polluted environmentally somewhere. Have they been have they been abiding by privacy laws in every jurisdiction they operate? And I don't know what privacy laws are like or like, I don't know
In
what privacy
dating,
laws. Yeah, I mean like,
how what privacy laws are in dating?
but it's I mean the dating's a funny example, but it's like really
It was
le
so funny the example you gave there, because you said dating, and then the moment you were like who have they been selling their products, I was like, hold on a minute, where are you going with this, Ryan? I
who
was like,
it might be who have you been seeing and who have you gone on dates with in the past, raised money from, um, all those things.
raise money from? Come on, Ryan, that's not legal here, is it?
I'm not trying to tie it that way, but really, like when you do these deals where you're raising like whether you're raising money through outside capital or outside investors, again, raising money, debt, sort of similar process, or can kind of work out to be a similar process, or selling your company. I mean, it's pretty invasive. Like you really have to
Right.
anticipate that someone's going to ask all the questions and all the tough questions. And the hint is everyone's got something wrong with their business, and that's okay.
Hmm.
You know, your paperwork might not have always been in place, and that's why it's really important that you try to earn a little bit of extra revenue, or you try to charge a little bit more for your margin, so you have the money to invest in good accountants, in good lawyers, in good staff and personnel and advisors, like just good people in your team. And good doesn't always mean expensive, but often good is expensive. But it's having those people in the team early enough throughout the process that, for years we've been operating on the right path, as opposed to for 10 years we've been doing the wrong thing and we don't want to tell anyone, but we have a crazy amount of sales. And now, how do we cross this gap of, we didn't want to tell people we've been selling this product that's got intellectual property with no agreements in place,
Yeah.
right? Like who owns the intellectual property? And sometimes deals die and it's okay. And that's maybe a hint for founders that, okay, well, now going forward, we have to clean things up. But if anyone wants to get ready for that process and think about acquisitions, either them acquiring someone, because small businesses and small ventures can totally acquire other businesses. It's just like you should be thinking about the dating example in marriage. Like, are you comfortable marrying that side of the family? Because you're probably marrying that whole side of the family, not just the person you want to marry. You're marrying the other co-founders, and you're marrying
Right.
the other employees, and you're marrying the other
Right.
advisors. And the reality is, it doesn't always work out. So there will be some family falling outs. Um, but do you want to do that? Or when you sell, are you ready to give up your baby? And,
Hmm.
and it's a very real question. And actually, with every acquisition I've been on, or at least every acquisition I can really think about, the founders that were clearly the most passionate about not just their business, but the problems and their customers and their users and the people that they started a business for to really help, the ones that really care, without fail, and it usually happens somewhere between a week out and like the night before we're signing, or actually it's 4 hours before we're supposed to sign and exchange signatures. I usually get a panic phone call or a phone call and it's along the lines of, am I really doing this?
Hmm.
Am I really selling? I mean, what happens tomorrow? Am I an employee? Because usually after a sale, there's like a transition period. But so baked into that is
Yeah.
like, so what do I do tomorrow? I mean, one funny question I had was, it was around a Canadian and US holiday together, and the closing happened with the lawyers tomorrow, or was going to happen tomorrow, but it was a US holiday, and the buyers
Right.
were Americans. And so our client asked us, do I have to show up for work tomorrow? And we're like, yeah, like please show up for work. And just because your new corporate overlords are probably on vacation because it's an important U.S. holiday for family. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, you probably have to show up, and they're not answering your calls because they're actually on holidays already. But yeah, you have to
Right.
show up tomorrow. And I mean, the thing I'd say with founders, and it's okay to ask yourself that question, but it's like, I don't have kids, but I imagine it'd be like sending your kids off to college or to school for the first
Hmm.
time. It's like, I'm saying goodbye, aren't I? What happens after this? Right? And
Right.
it's a weirdly emotional position, but it's normal. It happens. I mean, I think the bigger question should probably be something like, are you just ready to sell for whatever reason? It's too stressful. It's been too long. Maybe the product's not going to work out or be as big as it can be in your hands, and now makes sense to sell, or
Hmm.
or down the spectrum of, we've got an amazing deal. This is the right time to sell. We can totally take chips off the table, and now we can take that money and have a little bit of time to relax and figure out our next venture. And we're just setting ourselves up for success in the future. And those things make a ton of sense to do. But ultimately, one of those emotional things you should ask yourself after you get over those main questions about, do I want to sell and am I okay selling, is thinking about what you're going to do after.
Right. I'm actually, as we kind of come to the end here, I'm gonna kind of switch it a little bit. So I've heard a lot about like activist investors. Like these investors that come into a company and try and kind of take it in the direction of a certain vision. And I
Yeah.
wonder, as a lawyer, what your role is in sort of doing these sorts of I don't know if the right word is a syndicate or venture capital or in representing those interests. Uh,
Yeah, it's so a lot of activists where you'll read about a lot of activist investors is more in the public market spaces where you've got publicly traded companies where an outside investor can acquire a significant enough position of shares in a short period of time such that they can influence decisions. They might not have enough influence that they can totally elect directors, but they've got enough decision making, they've got enough influence that people have to take them seriously. And I want to differentiate between those types of activist investors and the types that I might see more in the private space, because for folks watching, a lot of my practice is with private companies. They're private companies. They don't have to publicly report. You can't buy these companies over a stock market or using the apps in your pocket. Like I was talking about with Victor earlier, these companies have shareholders agreements in place that say you can't even sell your shares to strangers on the internet. You actually have to go through a
right.
process, or there has to be a permitted thing. So the activist investors that we would see more in my private space are they're more like the new investors coming on that are meant to shake things up. And they come about either because of candidly a little bit of desperation or strong need for capital. And someone says,
Mm,
I'm willing to come in, I'm willing to help, I'm willing to invest or loan you this money, but here are my terms and they're a bit steep.
mm,
And the other hand of the coin might be we're excited to come in, we're excited to partner with this new investor, but they're also going to change things up. They're going to we're raising at that a large seed round, and those investors really want us to get to Series A, and to go there we have to go from 1 million of revenue last year, and we're about 2-ish this year. They're going to hold our feet to the fire to make sure we hit the revenue metrics that we thought, and they're going to hold our feet to the fire to make sure our HR team is hiring 30 people this year where we're only 28 people this year. We've got to grow by
right.
105% in 8 months to hit these goals. We have
Right.
to we have to hire this level of awesome sales talent and software team, and our founders have to excite this many people to come on the team.
Mm,
So these activist investors might help you grow in terms of strategy and set incredibly ambitious goals, and it's just not the thing that everyone wants. Sometimes your venture that's at this size and at this size, um, it's really fun for a lot of the key people, but when they want it to grow to be this big and it's off screen, it's not going to work for everyone. And so some
right.
activist investors, and I loosely say activists because we wouldn't usually say that, but some sort of investors that you come in, they're going to have that DNA of strong growth, of different culture, of different perspectives. Some of those perspectives are a little bit more corporate, and um, not everyone's going to fit in that mold. Sometimes layoffs are possible as different divisions or different focuses happen. Some key projects that people have been working on just aren't going to work out, or they get canceled because they're not part of this vision, or the only way we can get to this lofty ambition is to focus all of our money on one path, and anything that's not focusing on that just has to stop.
Right.
Um, in those cases, a lot of those questions that I would get involved with as a lawyer would be asking those founders from day one, do you want to get into bed with that person?
Mm,
Are you ready to marry that person? Are you ready to marry that person and have your employees, be exposed to that person and have to follow their vision, because they're going to be calling a lot of the shots going forward.
right. Right. Right.
And, hopefully the answer is yes, like an enthusiastic yes. Or it's somewhere along the lines of, right? Or it might be, I know they've got big ambitions. Now that it's going to be a tough one, but we're really excited for the challenge. It's not just I, but we, the team, are excited for that and that risk and the unknown and the uncertainty, and we're excited by that. And so a lot of the
Interesting.
activist investors that I'd see really, it's not like those outside public investors that will influence boards and influence decision making in the public sphere, but it's actually they'll probably take a more sizable position than what you'd read about in the news with like a Carl Icahn, um, or Bill Ackman. Like you're going to find those outside activist investors have a certain role within the niche to shake things up, and you know personal opinions aside, In theory, they're supposed to be there to shake up companies that are existing and probably stagnating for different reasons, or they're investing capital in the wrong ways. If they've done their job right, in theory, they should be there to shake things up in a good way. And I think a lot of these activist investors you might see, and I'd say more of these, you probably call them venture, like VC investors or venture capital investors or strategic investors. In the private space, they have their input, and hopefully they change things up in a good way.
So the other question I had was regarding Elon Musk. So, uh, we all, I mean, he's the richest man in the world. We all, in certain regards, some more than others, listen to a little bit of, or see what he does. And for me, it's probably a bit more personal because I invest in Tesla, right? And anytime the man speaks, my stocks gets hit. So,
Yep. Yeah, they definitely do.
so my thing is, as a like, first of all, as a lawyer for someone like Elon Musk, who has a tendency to just like, I don't know, tell Taylor Swift that he could impregnate her. He actually said that.
Yeah, yeah, I saw that, and no comment, but what the hell?
Exactly. What the hell? So for me, I've often been curious, like, what do the lawyers that represent Elon Musk have to do to prevent him from totally? I know at this point, obviously, the Tesla is a company, is a different entity on itself, and I don't imagine that the liability from some of the things Elon Musk might say or do gets transferred to Tesla, apart from obviously the moral pain that gets
Yeah.
transferred. But what do the lawyers, and maybe that's part of what the lawyers do to make sure that there's not a lot of blowback from his activities on the company. So I just wanted to get a lawyer's perspective on representing a person that may be as volatile, I don't know,
Yeah, yeah.
as Elon Musk.
Yeah, I mean, easy to say I don't act for Musk, so I can totally speculate here, and not a U.S. lawyer, and then things in America are totally different in terms of there's freedom of speech and what you can say. On Canada, defamation risk is a bigger thing. In America, there's freedom of speech to say a little bit more, probably a lot more. But I think that maybe another way of saying the question or thinking about it is, how do we as lawyers, at least how do I as a lawyer, manage difficult clients? And a lot of it comes down to the early meetings about deciding whether I want to act for them.
Hmm.
We don't act for everyone. In fact,
Right.
as we get busier and as I get busier and build a practice, I won't work for everyone. There's some people that it's not going to be my cup of tea. They're in a space that's just not of interest to me, or they're working on something that's it's just not the best use of my skills and my help and my real emotional fortitude and emotional and mental investment in someone who's working on certain ideas or personalities. And that's okay.
Mm,
And what I'd say,
right.
when you have difficult personalities like that, and I think whether I'm a lawyer or someone who's thinking about working with someone with a difficult personality, I think the decision points are pretty similar. It's, do I want to serve that person? Do I want to work with that person? Do I want to work for that person? Um, the more challenging the personality, the more you tend to work for than with, but right? But the reality is, do I want to spend my limited time on this earth with that person? And sometimes difficult personalities are because you need a difficult person with a stubborn vision about where we can be and where we're going. And you need those difficult personality types to have the conviction to go to some place that just doesn't exist. And
Right.
so those tough personality types, they're totally important, and they're not always the most pleasant, but we do need people like that to move the needle a little bit.
Yeah.
And so they're okay. Like, they don't always do things right. Sometimes they cause their own lawsuits. Sometimes they're like, well, what the hell, man? Did you really
I know, right?
did you really need to say that? I mean, I know you can afford the lawsuit, but do we need the lawsuit? It's not whether we can, but whether we should. And the
Yeah.
reality is, as lawyers, our job is to help enable our clients be the best they can be. Um,
Yeah.
if our clients want to carry themselves however they want to carry themselves, and we're happy to represent them, then I would say, if I was Elon Musk's lawyer, I'd speculate that I would be okay with his eccentricities. I would be
Mm.
okay with the fact that, you know, he's going to do things that are going to cause more work for me, which should be good in theory because I do more work. And
Yeah.
it's not always going to be fun or clean. It's going to be chaotic and it's going to be legally challenging problems. And, hopefully Elon Musk has lawyers that are excited for that challenge of working with, a demanding personality who demands the best. That's my
Right.
impression is he has high
Right.
expectations. They're lawyers who want to meet those expectations. They're lawyers who want to meet those under very challenging timelines. And they might even see that there's a potential lawsuit on Twitter, or X formerly known as Twitter, before they even get the email of, hey, we have to talk. And that's
Yep.
okay.
Yep.
So I'd say as lawyers, you just have to know who your clients are, or if you're founders or co-founders looking to partner with someone, ask yourself really, is that the type of person, um, is that the type of person with our rose-tinted lenses off that I want to work with? And I want to work with
Mm.
them on the really tough days, knowing that the good days are worth the tough days. And if I'm okay with
Right.
that, then I've got to be okay with the whole package. And
Right.
I've got demanding clients that have high expectations, and that's good. We want to meet those expectations. Um, we want to work with people that are challenging. It makes us better people. It makes us better lawyers. It's more fun to work on challenging problems. You can't, not every file can be emotionally challenging, 20 hours a day, but
Yeah.
it's part of the fun. It's part of the challenge. And difficult people or demanding people or people with high expectations they're important. They're important parts of the ecosystem.
Interesting. Interesting. Hmm. So, I mean, I'll make this my final question. So what would you say, I mean, for you, what's the most rewarding part of working with startups?
Yeah, there's a lot. So if I can boil it down to maybe one or a couple things, what's really rewarding is seeing where people start and just how awesome they are and how they really get into their groove and their rhythm. What I mean by that is like you see these founders who, what I really like are I really enjoy working with the founders that have this crazy domain experience, but it's no business experience whatsoever. They're the
Wow.
sciences and the STEM faculties. They're the founders who
Yeah.
are software developers or programmers. They're the really passionate nerds who have a really neat technology space and the passion's overflowing for their niche space, and they don't really know what's going on in terms of they just don't have the experience for hiring, for growth, for tough conversations, for unfortunately letting people go that aren't working out to protect the
Right.
company or the greater good of people. Um, to filter out different investors and to have to say no to money that they really need because it's not the right fit,
Right.
knowing there's a risk that they might not work and things might fail because they've said no to this money because it's ultimately
Mm.
wrong. And seeing how rewarding it is when they make tough decisions and they totally grow and you watch them from the sidelines as they become a better version of themselves and the companies get better and some of these junior employees that just left university that have taken risks on these jobs and you see them on the cap table and you see this person's name who has equity and you might search them and see they're formerly a grad student or they just graduated university and they're deciding to go for this company and work for this company instead of working for a big aerospace company or a big Microsoft or Google or Intel or IBM or and there's nothing wrong with those big companies, but they're taking a risk on something small that's super risky, probably
Mm.
with pay below than what they need or they could get elsewhere. And you see
Right.
these people taking these risks, both employees and founders, and they all grow over time and seeing that growth after a couple of years where someone's in their groove, they're confident, they get it. The problems that before would have taken hours for them to solve or weeks, or they would have agonized and lost sleep, and seeing
Yeah.
them just effortlessly deal with them. The closest analogy I can say is like watching the Peaky Blinders and seeing how in earlier seasons of the show, there's these corner gangs and these local gangs and these city gangs. And
Yeah.
later on, they've challenged city gangs to regional gangs, to government, to shadowy actors, to big business, to big political ideologies, to international crime. They're challenging all these terrible, like these tough problems. And in season one, a small gang almost crippled them. And later
Yeah.
on, these small problems are not even problems anymore. They don't even move the needle. They can just totally
Right.
dispel them with the experience they have. And so that progress of what's a founder like in season one, and what's a founder like in season 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, before the series finale when they sell their company. That full circle is really rewarding. That's
Yeah.
that's why I do it.
I'm glad we're both fans of Tommy Shelby here. We're both Peaky Blinders, man.
I mean, not always
Yeah.
his decisions, but I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
he's certainly charismatic and he's certainly interesting, and things are never boring with Thomas Shelby.
Wow. So on that blinding note, we're gonna bring the interview here to an end. Obviously, you guys at home, if you have questions for Ryan, obviously put them in the chat. Maybe we might be able to convince him to come for an Ask Me Anything episode, almost anything. Maybe we can get him to come in for an Ask Me Anything episode, but you guys have to ask him those questions, those really important questions. I'm sure he'll be down for answering them. Won't you, Ryan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, drop notes and comments. My email's pretty public. If you Google Ryan Bencic, Ryan phonetic, and then Bencic, Bencic, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me online. You can find me on email. Always happy to chat with founders. The joke I say is, coffees are always on me as my treat, and want to chat and answer as many questions and see if we can make the Vancouver tech scene and the Canadian tech scene a little bit better.
Yeah. Cool story. I met Ryan actually at the Vancouver Startup Week this year. Okay, so thank you guys. Thank you so much for listening today. Thank you, Ryan, for coming on the show and giving us your time generously. Bless. So till next time, when I bring you another interview, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe down below. I'll see you on the next one. Take care, guys.
Thanks for hosting, Victor.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wolf of Young Street podcast. If you derive value from this podcast, please don't forget to subscribe. I would love to hear from you as well. So please comment your thoughts down below.